Everyone, I'm Shelley, and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another reading from Paradise Found by William F. Warren. And today I'm going to be reading the second half of Part 6, Chapter 3, The Bearing of Our Results on the Problem of the Origin and Earliest Form of Religion. Now, since this is the second half, make sure that you've listened to the first half. And I would certainly say all of the other prior chapters, and I do have a playlist for this book. But let's get started right now on today's reading. First, then, according to Genesis, the earliest representatives of the human race began their existence in paradise unclad, unhoused, and possessed of none of the outward and visible signs of what is called civilization. Had Mr. Lubbock been permitted at the time to visit the spot, he would have seen, so far as Moses suggests, no printing press, no power loom, perhaps not even a fire drill or flint arrowhead. He would have seen no God, no Miltonic guard of angels, no Eden gates, no temple or altar. He would have noticed in the luxuriant tropical landscape simply a wealth of graceful animal forms, rising in manifold gradations and culminating in two fair human figures. He would doubtless have gone his way and reported at the next meeting of the Anthropological Society the discovery of a new Otaheite, whose naked and artless inhabitants were evidently at the bottom of the scale as respects culture, and in the sub-fetishistic atheistic stage as respects religion. So doing, he would have committed no greater blunder than many of his favorite reporters have made in describing such people as the Andaman Islanders. According to the old conception, no less than according to the new, the arts were only gradually developed. Men were destitute of the art of metalworking and of all to which that was essential until the days of Tubal Cain. Musical instruments there were none until invented by Jubal. Everything in sacred scripture indicates the kind of social and industrial progress for which, in connection with the beginnings of human society, one would naturally look. So far, then, the believer in sacred history has no occasion whatever to disagree with the believer in natural history. Haeckel and Peschel and Caspari hold, with Moses, to the monogenesis of the race, and even place their imaginary Lemuria just under the northern portion of the Indian Ocean, hard by one of the traditional seats of Eden. Their account of man's migrations from that center, and of his primeval destitution of the arts, conflict with no fact recorded in Holy Scripture. Neither party can tell precisely how long the period antecedent to the rise of the first great historic civilizations of Asia, Egypt, and Greece lasted, and neither can tell how long ago it terminated, so that even in their confessed ignorances both are in accord. But secondly, the believer in sacred history, Hebrew or ethnic, cannot accept the eagerly advocated notion that the intellectual condition of the earliest men was not higher than that of the lowest savages of today. Ignorant of many things those earliest generations must have been, but it is equally certain that they must have been above the line which separates stationary or retrograding peoples from progressive ones. They were men capable of investigating the powers and laws of nature, of originating arts absolutely new in the history of the world, and of making successive inventions which revolutionized the social state. With this representation, we should expect the Darwinian, on sober second thought, to agree. For it is a well known fact that our lowest savages are dying out, while the men who peopled the world in accordance with the law of the survival of the fittest, at a period in the earth's history when, in important respects, according to Darwin, the environment was less favorable to the human struggle for existence than now, must have been superior to these degenerating and vanishing tribes. And as all evolutionists, in enumerating the qualities which win in the struggle for existence, lay great stress upon superior intellectual endowments, it is only a natural inference that the native intelligence of the earliest men was at least superior to that of the lowest modern savage. Turning to the writers in question, we find our antecedent expectations confirmed. Thus, Mr. Herbert Spencer, in one of his maturest works, expresses himself as follows. There are sundry reasons for suspecting that existing men of the lowest types, forming social groups of the simplest kinds, do not exemplify men as they originally were. Probably most of them, if not all of them, had ancestors in higher states, and among their beliefs remained some which were evolved during those higher states. There is inadequate warrant for the notion that the lowest savagery has always been as low as it is now. That supplanting of race by race and thrusting into corners such inferior races as are not exterminated, which is now going on so actively, and which has been going on from the earliest recorded times, must have ever been going on. And the implication is that remnants of inferior races taking refuge in inclement, barren, and otherwise unfit regions have retrograded. In like manner, Darwin himself conceives of the first men as capable of rising in thought above the knowledge furnished by the senses, as able to represent to themselves the unseen and spiritual. And he expressly calls their mental faculties high, saying the same high mental faculties which first led men to believe in unseen spiritual agencies, then in fetishism, polytheism, and ultimately in monotheism, would infallibly lead him, so long as his reasoning powers remained poorly developed, to various strange superstitions and customs. Thus, Darwin justly considers the character of the very aberrations of the human intellect in its infantile stage a striking proof of the loftiness of its powers. Lubbock ascribes to the earliest men a like ability to conceive of the supersensual and to govern themselves largely by ideals. Though sometimes describing the primitive generations as in a state of utter barbarism, or as having been no more advanced than the lowest savages of today, this seems to occur only by inadvertence, for in the later editions of his already quoted work, The Origin of Civilization, page 483, he expressly admits and asserts that he does not regard cannibals as representatives of the first men. On the same page, he says, "It may be as well to state emphatically that all brutal customs are not, in my opinion, primeval. Human sacrifices, for instance, were, I think, certainly not so." Caspari no less emphatically affirms that the social state of the North American Indians and of the Australians is not primitive, but a result of degeneration. He says, "We know a succession of such tribes, of which, in fact, only ausgeartete, verkommene Banden und stattliche Splitter remain in existence, who, wild and savage, wander about in the primitive forests, miserably to perish." Tyler takes the same general ground, maintaining that the best representatives of primitive men are not the lowest but the higher of the uncivilized races. Thus, he says, in a study of the nature myths of the world, it is hardly practicable to start from the conceptions of the very lowest human tribes and to work upward from thence to fictions of higher growth, partly because our information is meager as to the beliefs of these shy and seldom quite intelligible folk, and partly because the legends they possess have not reached the artistic and systematic shape which they attain to among races next higher in the scale. It therefore answers better to take as a foundation the mythology of the North American Indians, the South Sea Islanders, and other high savage tribes who best represent in modern times the early mythological period of human history. In chapter 2 of the same work, he presents the evidence that many of the very lowest tribes of the modern world have become what they are by degeneration. But thirdly, if the best representatives of the first men must be sought not among the lowest, but rather among the higher of the uncivilized peoples, then surely we are justified in rejecting the notion of all those writers who, since the time of De Brosses and Comte, have maintained that primitive men personified and vitalized and fetishized all natural objects about them. On this point, the author of the Outlines of Cosmic Philosophy is less clear sighted than his master, Herbert Spencer. Boldly and ably as he criticizes Comte in some other particulars, in this Mr. Fiske surrenders to him wholly. He says, "We may safely assert, with Comte, that the earliest attitude assumed by the mind in interpreting nature was a fetishistic attitude. Spencer, however, recognizing the fact that the lower mammals, birds, and even insects are able to distinguish animate from inanimate objects, and that to deny this capacity to the first men would be to make them less and lower than animals, commits himself unreservedly to the view in harmony with that of the biblical record. Quoting the stock examples of savages who, on first seeing a watch or a compass, imagined that it was alive, he shows the naturalness of the mistake, and very properly says, "We must exclude these mistakes made in classing things which advanced arts have made to simulate living things, since such things mislead the primitive man in ways unlike those in which he can be misled by the natural objects about him." Limiting ourselves to his conceptions of these natural objects, we cannot but conclude that his classification of them into animate and inanimate is substantially correct. Concluding this, we are obliged to diverge at the outset from certain interpretations currently given of his superstitions. The assumption, tacit or avowed, that the primitive man tends to ascribe life to things which are not living is clearly an untenable assumption. Consciousness of the difference between the two, growing ever more definite as intelligence evolves, must be in him more definite than in all lower creatures. To suppose that without cause he begins to confound them is to suppose the process of evolution inverted. This writer, therefore, whom Darwin in one passage calls our great philosopher, explicitly rejects the dogma of the primitiveness and universality of animism and fetishism among the earliest men. According to him, animistic and fetishistic beliefs were not primary beliefs. They were errors into which the primitive man was betrayed during his early attempts to understand the surrounding world. The primitive man no more tends to confound animate with inanimate than inferior creatures do. Caspari, too, as we have seen, denies to fetishism a primitive character. Ascribing its rise to the new ideas which the discovery of the art of fire kindling produced, he makes the worship of the morally exalted, des sittlich Erhabenen, represented by the personal father, the tribal chieftain, and the deceased ancestor, far older, possibly thousands of years older, than any worship of fetishes. With Lubbock, there is no moral element in religion until it reaches its last and highest stage. With Caspari, on the contrary, religion is essentially moral in its first emergence, and has from the first moment of its existence an actual and relatively worthy personal object. This is a prodigious scientific advance from the positions of Hume, Comte, Lubbock, and all their followers, and by postulating a high moral nature and moral life at the very beginnings of human history, it renders the biblical conception of those beginnings not only conceivable, but even antecedently probable. Fourthly, the Bible and the sacred traditions of nearly all peoples present monogamy as the first form of marriage, ascribing all deviations from it to the ungoverned, selfish passions of men. This view, Lubbock and the writers whom he has followed, McLennan and Morgan, emphatically reject. These theorists claim that among the first men, the late Oneida community system of complex marriage, or as Lubbock calls it, communal marriage, universally obtained. The appropriateness of the term marriage is very far from clear. The first communities were mere herds, in which all the women were wives to all the men. In McLennan's opinion, the next stage was that form of polyandry in which brothers had their wives in common. Afterward came that of the levirate, the system under which, when an elder brother died, his second brother married the widow, and so on with the others in succession. Thence he considered that some tribes branched off into endogamy, others into exogamy, that is to say, some forbade marriage out of others within the tribe. If either of these two systems was older than the other, he held that exogamy must have been the more ancient. Exogamy was based on infanticide and led to the practice of marriage by capture. Lubbock, on the contrary, believes that the communal marriage, which he assumes to have been the primitive form, was gradually superseded by individual marriage founded on capture, and that this led first to exogamy and then to female infanticide, thus reversing Mr. McLennan's order of sequence. Endogamy and regulated polyandry, though frequent, he says, I regard as exceptional and as not entering into the normal progress of development. Still different is the theory of Bachofen, set forth in his work titled Das Mutterrecht. Assuming sexual promiscuity as the primordial state, he considers that under this system the women, instead of being rendered more and more debauched and corrupted by the practice, as we might suppose, became on the contrary in process of time so refined that after a season they felt shocked and scandalized by the beastly state of things, revolted against it, and established a system of marriage with female supremacy, the husband being subject to the wife, property and descent being required to follow the female line, and women enjoying the principal share of political power. Gradually, however, the more spiritual ideas associated with fatherhood prevailed over the more material ideas associated with motherhood. The father came to be considered the real author of life to the offspring, the mother a mere nurse. Property and descent were traced in the male line. Sun worship superseded moon worship. Men absorbed all political power. In a word, as primitive heterismus was followed by the mother law system, so this now gave way to the modern social state. The chief evolutionist authorities disagreeing so widely on this point, it is surely proper to look further. So doing, we find a number of at least equally respectable scientific and speculative representatives of the evolutional school who expressly question, if they do not openly reject, the dogma of universal sexual promiscuity as the primeval social state. Thus, Herbert Spencer argues through many pages of his Principles of Sociology against McLennan, claiming that monogamy must be conceived of as going back to the beginning. However unsettled social and sexual relations then were, promiscuity, he affirms, was checked by the establishment of individual connections prompted by men's likings and maintained against other men by force. Again, he says, the impulses which lead primitive men to monopolize other objects of value must lead them to monopolize women. And again, monogamy dates back as far as any other marital relation. Darwin takes substantially the same view, positively discrediting the alleged sexual promiscuity of the earliest communities. In like manner, another of the latest of English writers on this subject, James A. Farrer, in his book entitled Primitive Manners and Customs, emphatically rejects the notion that a brutal and forcible bride capturing was ever universal, and denies that the customs relied upon by McLennan and others to prove its prevalence are to be viewed as a survival of such a custom. As to the absolutely first form of marriage, he does not express an opinion, but the theory of primitive monogamy would better agree with his general representation than any other. The same may be said of Caspari, who, though he does not expressly postulate the priority of monogamy, yet ascribes to filial piety a role in the first origination of religion, which seems to necessitate such a postulate. So Mr. John Fiskey's suggestion that the transition from the anthropoid animals to truly human beings was probably affected by the prolongation of infancy and of parental care incident to the slower evolution of a highly complex organism, and by the family life thus necessitated and brought about, is more harmonious with the doctrine of primitive monogamy than with any other. It would not be surprising, therefore, if this class of considerations, which we meet again in Noir's theory of the origin of language, should gradually lead to such a reconstruction of Darwinistic sociology as will postulate monogamy as the one and only form of sexual relation by virtue of which man could have arisen out of the lower and preceding animal orders. Mr. Spencer calls Mr. Fiskey's suggestion an important one, and he explains it in a note appended to a significant declaration respecting the biological and sociological value of monogamy. Elsewhere, after stating that irregular relations of the sexes are at variance with the welfare of the society, of the young and of the adults, and after ascribing the gradual dying out of the Andamanese to their promiscuity of sexual relation, he says, We may infer that the progeny of such unions as had a degree of exclusiveness and durability were more likely to be reared and more likely to be vigorous. Again, a page or two later, he uses this language. As under ordinary conditions, the rearing of more numerous and stronger offspring must have been favored by more regular sexual relations, there must on the average have been a tendency for these societies most characterized by promiscuity to disappear before those less characterized by it. But Spencer himself must grant that in the earliest ages, upon the whole, the race multiplied and spread from generation to generation, so that we must at least conclude from his own declaration that the approximately monogamous societies and unions were more numerous than the approximately promiscuous ones. Well, therefore, may Mr. Lang, our latest advocate of McLennan's theory, concede the possibility that man originally lived in the patriarchal or monogamous family, and seek to content his fellow sociologists with the assurance that if there occurred a fall from the primitive family, and if that fall was extremely general, affecting even the Aryan race, Mr. McLennan's adherents will be amply satisfied. Fifthly, the Bible represents the earliest men as capable of entertaining the conception of a supreme divine being, the maker of the heavens and earth, the creator and rightful Lord of men. It represents them as capable of realizing the moral obligation of obedience to the Creator, and as possessed of freedom to obey or to disobey. It gives us to understand that, as a matter of fact, a few then as now were faithful to their light and to their convictions of duty, while the greater part lived in conscious violation of the promptings of their own consciences. As a natural consequence, immoralities multiplied. These demoralized and brutalized those who practiced them. Then demoralized and brutalized parents were followed by children less well instructed and less well endowed than they themselves had been. And so, despite exceptional men and exceptional families who were more faithful to conscience, the general demoralization went on. The Song of Lamech, Genesis 4:23 and 24, is the song of a true savage, though of one who has known the law of right and duty. One can hardly read it without imagining it first sung in a kind of domestic war dance in the hut of its polygamous author. He glories in his homicides, and evidently belongs to those who with savage lust and brutality took them wives of all which they chose. He was a representative of his Cainite kindred. By the mass of these and those who intermarried with them, the Father and Lord of all creatures was ignored and gradually misconceived, and at last superseded by creations of man's own disordered mind and heart, until the pure primitive religion of the righteous patriarchs became a false worship as irrational and immoral as the mass of those who gave themselves to its loathsome and cruel practices. With some populations, this abnormal and immoral evolution proceeded to thoroughly unnatural and self destructive results, such as religious prostitution, sodomy, human sacrifices, cannibalism, etc. On the other hand, then as now, fidelity to truth and goodness led its possessor to larger knowledge and to higher spiritual experiences. Then, as ever, the principle held good, to him that hath shall be given. Hence, alongside and within and above the historic evolution of a large portion of the race from evil to evil, there was another evolution of a smaller but more vital portion from good to good. If Satan's kingdom steadily unfolded, so did also the kingdom of God. And while the one was in the direction of spiritual and physical degeneration and death, the other was in the direction of life and ultimate spiritual ascendancy. Both of these partial or special evolutions were within and part of the universal evolution of the race under its pre-established nature and conditions, one of which fundamental conditions is its immanency in the divine. Such is the picture presented us by all the monotheistic religions of the world, and it is substantially confirmed by most of the ancient traditions of the human race. Now, in all this, there is nothing inconsistent with any well established facts or principles of science. Some authorities which Lubbock himself quotes prove not only that uncivilized tribes are capable of entertaining the theistic conception of the world, but also that not a few of them, when first found, actually possessed remarkably high and pure conceptions of the Supreme Spirit and of man's relation to him. Thus he cites Livingstone as saying that the uncontaminated African believes that the Great Spirit lives above the stars. In trying to prove the absence of prayer among certain savages, he admits witnesses who show that the Eskimos, the North American Indians, and the Caribs believed in the existence of a supreme spirit, the master of life. He even quotes the following objection to prayer made by Tomochichi, the chief of the Yamacraws, to General Oglethorpe, to wit, that the asking of any particular blessing looked to him like directing God, and if so, that it must be a very wicked thing. That for his part he thought everything that happened in the world was as it should be, that God of himself would do for every one what was consistent with the good of the whole, and that our duty to him was to be content with whatever happened in general, and thankful for all the good that happened in particular. What civilized religionist, what purist monotheist ever apprehended or expressed this theological problem more clearly than did this Indian chief? Lubbock quotes another author as saying that the Caribs considered the Great Spirit as endowed with so great goodness that he does not take revenge even on his enemies. So Mr. Tyler allows not only that most barbarians are able to conceive of a creator, but also that they actually believe in one. He says, races of North and South America, of Africa, of Polynesia, recognizing a number of great deities, are usually and reasonably considered polytheists. Yet their acknowledgement of a supreme creator would entitle them at the same time to the name of monotheists, if belief in a supreme deity, held to be the creator of the world and chief of the spiritual hierarchy, were the sufficient criterion of monotheism. High above the doctrine of souls, of divine manes, of local nature spirits, of the great deities of class and element, there are to be discerned in savage theology shadowings, quaint or majestic, of the conception of a supreme deity. He illustrates the prevalence of this conception by facts related of barbarous peoples in almost every quarter of the globe. Speaking of the remarkable clearness of this idea and belief among the New Zealanders, the Hawaiians, the Tongans, Samoans, and other representatives of the Polynesian race, he says, students of the science of religion who hold polytheism to be but the misdevelopment of a primal idea of divine unity, which in spite of corruption continues to pervade, it might well choose the South Sea Island divinity as their aptest illustration from the savage world. He quotes Mohrenhout as saying, Tauroa is their supreme, or rather only God, for all the others, as in other known polytheisms, seem scarcely more than sensible figures and images of the infinite attributes united in his divine person. He adds the following sublime native description of this supreme God. He was, Tauroa was his name, he abode in the void, no earth, no sky, no men. Tauroa calls but not answers, and alone existing, he became the universe. Though an unspoken opponent of the theory that polytheism arose from moral and spiritual degeneration, his own facts are so strong that for the explanation of some of them he is constrained to resort to it. Speaking of the conceptions of the supreme deity in the savage and barbaric world, he says, the degeneration theory may claim such beliefs as mutilated and perverted remnants of higher religions, in some instances, no doubt with justice. That a religion originally good and pure may degenerate and become corrupt is conceded even by Lubbock. At the close of his sketch of the lowest intellectual stages through which religion has passed, he uses this significant language. I have stopped short sooner, perhaps, than I should otherwise have done, because the worship of personified principles, such as fear, love, hope, etc., could not have been treated apart from that of the phallus, or lingam, with which it was so intimately associated in Greece, India, Mexico, and elsewhere, and which, though at first modest and pure, as all religions are in their origin, led to such abominable practices that it is one of the most painful chapters in human history. Reading this, the disciple of history simply asks, if men could so corrupt the originally modest and pure worship of Aphrodite, why not also the originally pure worship of El? Sixthly, the disclosure of the Arctic Eden solves all further difficulties in the Hebrew conception of the religious development of mankind. This doctrine, as to the cradle of the race, concedes to the devotee of prehistoric archaeology all his claims as to the lowly beginnings of every historic civilization developed in our post-diluvian seats of humanity. It welcomes every revelation which fossil bone or chipped flint or lacustrine pile or sepulchre mound has ever made, finding in it precious illustration of those times of ignorance through which our expatriated race has made its passage. It is equally ready for every conclusion of the scientific anthropologist. By his own doctrine of the power of environment, and by his own picture of mammalian life in tertiary and quaternary times, it constrains him to admit that if the Eden of Genesis was at the pole, the biblical picture of antediluvian man, with his extraordinary vigor and stature and longevity, with his extraordinary defiance of the authority of God, and with his extraordinary persistence in the indulgence of self-centered passions and appetites and ambitions, is credible in the highest degree, and that nothing may be lacking to its perfect confirmation, the comparative mythologist discovers that in this new Eden he is given the master key to his own science, and that every great system of ancient mythology and of mythological geography must now be freshly and intelligently interpreted in the light of it. The old stories of a golden age, of the Hesperidian gardens, of the tree of golden fruit, of the Hyperborean Macrobe, of the insurrection of the Titans, of the destruction of mankind by a flood, are history once more. Their authenticity as history is attested by new and unchangeable evidences, by witnesses as unbribable as the axis of the earth and the pole of the heavens. No more can the investigator of the history and philosophy of religion rule out the ancient myths of humanity as senseless, or seek to interpret them as results of an inevitable disease of language. No more can they be palmed off upon us as capricious variations of that myth of dawn, or of the sun, or of the storm, which we are told that the fancy of primitive men is ever weaving. They are simply blurred chapters from the neglected and abused and almost lost Bible of the Gentiles, confirming and establishing the opening chapters of our own. Summing up, then, we see 1. That in rejecting the historical conception of the primeval religious belief of mankind, Hume took up a position which none of his own successors consider as at all tenable. 2. The further these successors have carried their revolts against history, the more have they become involved in contradiction with each other. 3. The more consistently and radically the dogma of primitive savagery has been carried out, the more inevitably has it landed its advocates in the doctrine of primitive bestiality. 4. In their eagerness to destroy the possibility or credibility of primeval monotheism, these more consistent and radical theorists have inadvertently gone so far as to render a self-consistent evolutional biology or sociology impossible. In consequence hereof, of the more clear-sighted of the representatives of Darwinism are just now deftly reapproaching the long-scouted historic conception, by representing the first men as superior to the modern savage in intellectual endowment, by calling their powers high, by considering their judgments of natural objects substantially correct, by admitting their knowledge of the true and normal form of the family, by conceding to them a truly human appreciation of ethical excellences and obligations, by allowing to them a capacity to conceive of an almighty supreme spirit, the author and rightful governor of the world, and by recognizing that nearly all religions present clear traces of corruption. So far as principles are concerned, These representations surrender their whole case. With these data, Adamic revelation becomes quite as possible and quite as credible as Abrahamic or Mosaic or Christian revelation. The anlage for religion is no product of age-long advances in civilization and in the arts. The unclad Adam of the garden was no more incapacitated for the knowledge of his Father than was that naked second Adam, for whose advent Mary provided the swaddling clothes. If the former seems too undeveloped to be an organ of divine revelation, the latter, the highest of all these organs, the absolute revelator, began quite as low. If nomad Arabs of today can see in storms and stars sublime manifestations of one almighty personal power, why could not the nomadic Abel as well? If the gospel messenger of today can cause the rudest Fijian to know God and to experience a sense of divine forgiveness and favor, why may not God's earliest preachers of righteousness have produced a like effect on sincere souls before the discovery of the art of metalworking? Once let the anthropological and sociological postulates demanded even by Herbert Spencer be granted, and the ancient historic conception of primitive monotheism becomes both possible and eminently reasonable. As an escape from the conflicting and mutually destructive theories of the naturalistic school in its different departments, it presents, on merely speculative grounds, a positive attractiveness. Its full array of evidences, however, is simply coextensive and identical with the evidences for the reality of historic revelation as a whole. Everything which goes to show that God has intelligibly revealed himself to men at all bears more or less directly upon the credibility of a revelation in the beginning. Number 7. Lastly, the Arctic Eden completes the reconciliation of biblical and secular learning in their relations to the problem of the primitive religion of men. As we have seen, both science and theology now find in this primeval Bildungsherd at the pole the one prolific center whence all the floral and faunal and human life forms of the whole earth have proceeded. In an environment of such creatively potent, world overflowing nature forces as were there, any culmination of life's manifestations short of a golden race of men, kingly in stature, rishis in intelligence, measuring their diva like lives by centuries, would have been an incongruity. That a loving creator, creating because loving, should have put himself into instant personal communion with these highest of his creatures, moral natures fashioned in his own image and after his likeness, children of his love, is to a theist, even an ethnic theist, the only credible representation. That such a lusty race should have been open to temptation on the line of apparently innocent aspiration after still higher perfections, that they should have desired to be as gods, that they should have coveted experimental and personal knowledge of evil as well as of good. These are suppositions which no serious anthropologists will pronounce inadmissible. That the actual revolt of such an order of moral agents from the true law and basis of its life should have carried into its subsequent historic developments consequences of profoundest import is as much a necessary implication of the law of heredity and of the established constitution of nature as it is an instinctive inference from the preconceived character of a perfect moral governor. Given such antediluvian men, one must pronounce the history of antediluvian religion, as reported in the oldest memories and in the most sacred scriptures of humanity, a self attesting chronicle. That's the end of today's chapter. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one down below. And if you like my work and would like to support my channel, I will leave a link in the description for that as well. Or you can just click on it right on my channel page. And I hope you have a great day.